The siren was still echoing in my head when I pulled the patrol car onto the wet curb. On paper, the call was simple. Remove a homeless man causing trouble in front of a closed store. But there was nothing simple about what I saw when the headlights cut through the shadows. He was sitting on the ground, clutching a filthy blanket, his face buried in his arms. I took 2 steps forward, the radio on my shoulder crackled, and he lifted his head, and time froze. My stomach sank. The cold of the night cut through my vest like a blade. That face, those tired eyes, still carrying the same intensity as years ago. I knew that man. Knew him as if he were part of my own story. Not because he'd ever harmed me, but because once he had saved me. There, in the heavy silence, the smell of rain and asphalt hanging in the air, I realized nothing about this call would be routine. And in that instant, I knew there was no going back. I was born and raised in a small town in the heart of Texas, where everyone knew their neighbor's name and news traveled faster than the wind. My father was a mechanic, a man with calloused hands and a firm voice, and my mother, a nurse, the kind of person who could find beauty even in scars. From an early age, I learned 2 things: that life was hard, and that it was still worth fighting for. I grew up with a strange feeling that I needed to protect something. I didn't know what, but I carried that weight as if it were part of me. At 18, when most of my friends were deciding which college to go to, I had already decided to wear the badge. I wanted to make a difference, to keep the kind of evil that had once touched my family from reaching other people's doors. And when I say evil, I don't just mean criminals. I mean indifference, coldness, that feeling of abandonment I saw in my mother's eyes when she lost my father in a senseless robbery. That shaped me more than any academy training. I joined the force full of ideals, but the job quickly took them from me, one by one, leaving only what was necessary to survive. I learned fast that the line between right and wrong isn't always clear, that there are nights when the law and justice speak different languages, and that sometimes your only compass is your own conscience. I carry scars you can't see, faces that faded into the night, cries for help I couldn't answer in time, decisions that haunt me when I try to sleep. About 12 years ago, when I was still a rookie, something happened that I never told anyone. I was patrolling alone on a cold winter night, responding to a call about a robbery in progress. I stepped into a dimly lit alley and ended up cornered by 2 armed men. The cold of the night mixed with the icy sweat dripping down my face. I was going to die there. That's when he appeared. A stranger who, out of nowhere, pulled me out of the line of fire and covered me with his own body. Taking a blow meant for me. I didn't see his face clearly that night, only his eyes. Eyes I've never forgotten. He disappeared before the ambulance arrived, as if he had melted into the darkness. Years passed, and I learned to bury memories like that. It's easier to survive emotionally when you pretend certain things never happened. But deep down, that moment stayed with me like a debt I could never repay. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I'd catch myself wondering who he was, why he risked his life for a stranger, and what became of him. I never imagined I'd find the answer on a cold sidewalk, under a light rain, responding to a call that should have been just another routine stop. Today, after nearly 2 decades on the job, I'm no longer that idealistic kid. I'm a man who has seen the best and worst in people, often in the same face. I carry the weight of choices that can't be undone, and the certainty that, no matter how hard I try, I can't save everyone. But in that moment, looking at the man sitting there, recognizing the eyes that once saved my life, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Life giving me a second chance. And this time, I wasn't going to waste it. The night was unusually quiet for a Friday. The police radio in my car gave off only its usual static, interrupted now and then by distant voices reporting low-priority calls. I drove through the wet streets, the glow of the streetlights reflecting on the asphalt as if the city were wrapped in a sheet of glass. It was just past 11 when the call came in. Unit 12, request for assistance on a possible public disturbance. Location, in front of the old hardware store on Jefferson Street. Report of a homeless man causing a disturbance. The dispatcher's voice was so mechanical you could tell, to him, this was just another line on a report. But I knew that sometimes, behind calls like this, something much bigger was hiding. Jefferson Street was in the forgotten part of town, where old buildings stood like ghosts of themselves and shuttered businesses piled up like open wounds. That hardware store had been closed for years, ever since the owner died and no one stepped in to take over. It wasn't unusual for a homeless person to take shelter under its awning, especially during bad weather. But according to the report, the man was refusing to leave and was yelling alone in the middle of the street. Probably high, the dispatcher said, defaulting to the obvious. As I responded, "On my way," I felt that strange mix of boredom and vigilance that comes with the job. Most of these calls end with a few words and a ride to a shelter, but something about this one bothered me. Maybe it was the unusual quiet on the radio. Maybe it was the way the caller had described the situation, like there was fear hidden between the lines, even if they hadn't said it outright. I turned onto Jefferson Street from 8th Avenue. The faded facades and cracked windows formed a corridor of shadows. A steady drizzle fell, the sound of the wipers setting the pace for my thoughts. I switched on the patrol car's roof light as I approached the address, not to intimidate, but to announce my presence. From a distance, the scene seemed simple. A figure hunched under the awning, wrapped in a worn blanket, hugging himself. Beside him, a rusted shopping cart overflowing with plastic bags stood like a fragile wall against the world. As I drew closer, I realized he wasn't yelling. He was speaking softly, almost like he was talking to someone invisible. His words were lost in the rain, but there was something strange in his tone. It wasn't anger. It wasn't desperation. It was sorrow. I scanned the surroundings, alleys, half-open doors, dark windows. Everything was empty, as if the whole city had held its breath. The radio on my shoulder crackled, and Central asked if I needed backup. I said no, but my hand hovered near my weapon, not out of threat, but instinct. In situations like this, you never know what you're walking into. I stepped out of the patrol car, the cold wind cutting into my face. I approached slowly, speaking loud enough for him to hear me. "Good evening, sir. I'm with the police. Are you all right?" His voice, muffled under the damp fabric covering half his face, replied with something I couldn't understand. It wasn't resistance, nor aggression. It was like he was somewhere else entirely. Then, for a moment, the wind shifted, peeling the blanket away from his face. The dim light from the street lamp lit up familiar features, as if my mind had just forced open a locked drawer. The broken nose, the faint scar over his right eyebrow, and above all, the eyes. Eyes carrying an old weight, the same eyes that had met mine years ago, in the middle of a narrow alley, when death was only a trigger pull away. My body froze, not from the cold, but because a buried piece of my past was now standing right in front of me. My instincts screamed at me to step back, to steady my breathing, to regain control, but my legs moved forward on their own. He blinked slowly, studying me like someone who might recognize me, or might not. Behind us, the street seemed to vanish. The distant sound of a passing car, the drip of rain, everything faded until there was only the two of us. Me, in uniform, hand near my holster, and him, seated, fragile and soaked, yet carrying a presence that cut straight through me. The memory of the night he saved my life hit me full force, and with it came a question that gripped my chest. What had happened to him since then? How had the man who once pulled me back from death ended up here, forgotten in the shadows, armed only with a blanket and a shopping cart? That first moment told me everything. This wasn't going to be just another call. This was a reckoning with a past I had never wanted to revisit, and a feeling that this time I wouldn't have a choice. I parked the patrol car just a few feet from the awning, and the sound of the engine shutting off left the street wrapped in an eerie silence, broken only by the drip of rain from the gutters. At night, Jefferson Street had that kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the light whole. The nearest street lamp flickered like a tired eye, casting uneven amber flashes across the cracked asphalt. The air was heavy with the damp smell of rain, mold, and the bittersweet odor of trash piled up in forgotten corners. I stepped out of the car, feeling the cold cut through the fabric of my uniform like it had teeth. My boots echoed against the concrete, each step louder than it should have been, announcing my presence. The homeless man was there, motionless, hunched under the awning like an abandoned statue. The blanket wrapped around him was soaked through, but he didn't seem to care. Beside him, the rusted shopping cart, stuffed with plastic bags, looked like a fragile safe holding everything he owned. The store behind him was a tomb of broken glass and rotting wood. The faded letters on the peeling sign barely spelled out Jefferson Tools, a reminder that the place once had a purpose. A puddle reflected part of the facade, warping it like a ruined painting. Somewhere above, a loose metal sign clanged rhythmically against the wall, pushed by the wind. I approached slowly, hands visible, reciting the usual protocol. "Good evening, sir. I'm with the police. Are you all right?" His voice, muffled by the wet fabric covering half his face, muttered something I couldn't make out. It wasn't defiance, and it wasn't aggression. It was as if he was somewhere else, entirely, lost in a place I couldn't see. Then the wind shifted, peeling the blanket away from his face for just a moment. The dim, flickering light from the street lamp caught features I knew instantly, as if a locked drawer in my mind had been forced open. The crooked nose, the faint scar above his right eyebrow, and the eyes. Those same eyes, still carrying the weight of that night. The same eyes that had found mine in the middle of a narrow alley years ago, when death was just a breath away. Cold wave hit me from the inside out, but not from the weather. It was the shock of a memory I had worked hard to bury, clawing its way back to the surface. My instincts screamed at me to take a step back, to breathe, to regain control, but my legs moved forward on their own. He blinked slowly, watching me with an expression that was part recognition, part doubt. Behind us, the city seemed to disappear. The distant hum of a car, the steady drip of water, everything faded until there was only the two of us. Me in uniform, hand hovering near my holster, and him, seated, soaked, fragile, but radiating a presence that cut straight through me. The memory of the night he saved me hit with full force, bringing a single suffocating question with it. What had happened to him since then? How had the man who once pulled me from death ended up here, forgotten in the shadows, armed only with a blanket and a shopping cart? That first impression told me everything I needed to know. This was not going to be just another call. It was a collision with a past I had no intention of revisiting, and this time, there would be no walking away. I took another step forward, feeling my heart pick up like I was crossing into an invisible danger zone. The cold wind stung my face, carrying that damp smell of rust and abandonment. The man slowly raised his head, and now he was looking straight at me, unblinking, as if trying to confirm whether I was real or just another shadow in the night. The tension between us was almost tangible, and out of instinct my hand drifted closer to my holster, not as a threat, just the reflex of years of training for the unexpected. "Sir, I need you to stand up," I said, firm but controlled, the kind of voice I'd learned to use to keep things from escalating. He didn't respond. He simply loosened the blanket over his shoulders and placed his hands on the ground, as though he were deciding whether to obey or not. That's when I noticed he was shaking, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. A sudden metallic clatter echoed from across the street, probably a can kicked by the wind, but it was enough to put my entire body on high alert. My eyes swept the area quickly, scanning alleys, partially open doors, broken windows. Jefferson Street had a way of hiding trouble in the most unlikely corners. Finally, he moved, slowly, as if every joint weighed a ton. When he stood, I realized he was taller than I remembered, though now hunched over, as if the years and the weight of the world had pressed down on his spine. Up close, I could see him better. A thick, unkempt beard, torn clothes, and the sour-sweet mix of dirt and alcohol clinging to him. But none of that could erase the power in those eyes. "You," he began, his voice hoarse and raspy. "You were in the alley." My stomach turned. He remembered. Not only remembered, He recognized me in that frozen fragment of my past I'd tried so hard to forget. I couldn't answer right away. I swallowed. Hard, fighting to keep my professional composure. But inside, an avalanche of memories was breaking loose. The radio crackled on my shoulder. Unit 12, need backup? Over. I pressed the button and told them it was under control, though my voice didn't sound as steady as I wanted. With every passing second, this call was straying further and further from anything a manual could prepare me for. Then he took a step toward me, and my body reacted instinctively, shifting back slightly. It wasn't a threat, just the kind of sudden movement that triggers alarms in a tense environment. He raised his hands, showing they were empty, and then said something that hit harder than any bullet. "I didn't want you to see me like this." The words sliced through the cold air like a shot. In that instant, there was no uniform, no official role, just a debt, unspoken and heavy, binding us together from that night he bled so I could live. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed rapidly from the corner. 2 young men in hoodies emerged, spray cans in hand, heading for the wall beside us. One spotted us and stopped. The other kept going. The tension shifted instantly. I stepped in front of the man, moving him slightly back to keep him out of sight. "Stay where you are!" I shouted at the kids. They froze for a second before bolting the other way. I started toward them, but felt his hand grip my forearm, stronger than I expected. I turned, and his eyes told me everything without a word. Don't leave me. That's when I understood. My priority tonight had just changed, and whatever decision I made from here on out would have consequences I couldn't yet see. When the kids vanished around the corner, the silence fell heavy again, but something in the air had shifted. A thick, almost electric urgency, like the night itself was holding its breath for a verdict. He was still gripping my forearm, and I could feel the strength that lingered in his worn-out body. I gently loosened his hand, not wanting to break the invisible thread between us. He drew in a deep breath, as if gathering courage to face a cruel mirror, then nodded toward the shopping cart. "There's something in there. That's yours," he said, the words landing on me like a stone. I crouched beside the cart. The plastic bags crinkled, damp, releasing a smell of mildew and rust. Beneath a filthy coat and a rain-ruined book was a small shoebox, tied shut with an old sneaker lace. My pulse quickened for no reason I could name. I looked at him. He nodded again. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a gray rag, was a St. Michael pendant, its edges worn, the chain darkened by time. On the back, hand-engraved initials, JRM. My name, my medal, the one I'd lost the night in the alley. The gap in my memory ripped open. I'd had that medal since graduating the academy, a gift from my mother. I remembered its glint under the cold streetlight when those 2 men cornered me, the sudden force of a body slamming into me from behind, knocking me out of the line of fire, the warm slick of blood on my gloves, and a rough voice telling me to stay down. Then the sirens, the reports, and the void where the medal should have been. It hadn't been lost. It had been kept. "I pulled you out of that line of fire," he said, his voice breaking. "Found this on the ground. I promised I'd give it back when you were ready to remember." The words cut clean into me. Ready to remember. I'd spent years trying to forget. I looked up and met his eyes. In the flickering lamplight, I saw more now. A deep scar along his ribs, tracing a jagged path under his shirt, the poorly set break in his nose, the split eyebrow I'd already recognized. The marks of a man who had taken the night head-on for me. "Who are you?" My voice came out low, stripped of authority. Just human. He hesitated, as if hauling his name up from the bottom of a well. "Nathan. Nathan Cole." The name meant nothing, but the face meant everything. He glanced at the store's grimy window, where rain streaked the glass like time itself, dripping away. "I was a firefighter, then a paramedic. That night I was off duty, out drinking with the crew. I saw you go into that alley, saw the gun, and I ran. Didn't think twice. It clicked into place. The way he'd moved that night. Sharp, precise, fearless. It had been instinct, the kind only people born to save others possess. But there was more. After the alley," he went on, breathing shallowly, "came the bills. A suspension after a bar fight, the divorce, losing custody of my daughter. I tried to keep going. I swear I did. Then came the long nights, the pain that only fades with things that destroy you. One day, I woke up without the uniform, then without a home. I disappeared, learned how to hide from the eyes that knew me. He wasn't making excuses. He was handing me a map of the abyss. A cold guilt seeped into me because while I'd climbed the ladder in my career, he'd been sliding down a slope without brakes. And, somehow our fates had looped back together here. And why wait for me here? I asked, trying to piece together the geometry of this impossible coincidence. He nodded toward the abandoned store sign. My dad used to bring me here to fix things for the house. This place reminds me I once knew how to repair things. Someone at the shelter said cops still swing by these blocks on Fridays. So I come on Fridays, thought maybe God might build the bridge. God might build the bridge. I stood there, in uniform, face to face with an inverted miracle. Then he pulled from his coat pocket a folded scrap of cloth. It was an old police patch, frayed at the edges, stained in one corner. I recognized it instantly. The crooked stitching was mine. "You left this too," he said, holding it like it was fragile. I kept it to remind me that there was still something good in me. The realization hit like lightning. It wasn't just his identity or the confirmation of that night in the alley. It was knowing that while I had buried the memory to survive, he had kept it alive as his last anchor of dignity. He had saved me, and without knowing it, had made my existence a beacon that kept him from going completely dark. I wanted to say something. "Thank you. I'm sorry. I failed you. I should have looked for you," but the words got stuck behind the knot in my throat. Then the radio on my shoulder crackled. "Unit 12, status," caller phoned back, "says the individual is threatening to break the store window." I looked at the window, then at Nathan. He was standing still, hands empty, shoulders slumped. There was no threat, only a man holding on to the last thread, keeping him in this world. I pressed the radio button but didn't speak. The open mic hung in the air like an exposed heart. And in that space between protocol and truth, I realized the most important thing. The real discovery tonight wasn't who he was. It was who I was going to have to be from now on. Because the debt was back on the surface, alive, breathing, staring at me with the same eyes from the night in the alley. And no report, no manual, no order was going to save me from the choice that was coming next. I stood there just a few steps from him, with the fine drizzle falling over us, as if the world had decided to whisper instead of shout. The radio was still hissing on my shoulder, asking for a response I didn't want to give. For years, I'd hidden behind the shield of the badge, telling myself my job was to follow protocol, that every decision needed to be clean, objective, untouched by emotion. But now I was standing in front of the man who had pulled me from death, who had taken wounds to save me, who had carried scars, both in his body and in his soul, for a choice that had taken him only seconds, but had given me the rest of my life. The protocol was clear. Remove the individual from the area, take him to a shelter or a hospital, file the report, move on. But none of that made sense in this moment. The law didn't have a clause for invisible debts. The rulebook didn't tell you what to do when the individual was someone who had once saved your life and was, in some way, still trying to save it, because just standing there, reminding me of that night, was like tearing off a blindfold I'd worn for years. The image of the alley came back whole, the sound of metal clattering on the ground, the smell of gunpowder mixed with blood, the weight of his body pushing me out of the line of fire. I'd buried that memory like someone buries a landmine, afraid that stepping on it would make it explode. And now, here it was, alive, staring at me, demanding I do something. I felt split in two. On one side, the officer trained to stay detached, to treat everyone the same, to never let the past interfere with the present. On the other, the man who, if he had any humanity left, knew he couldn't just put Nathan in the back of the patrol car and drop him off at some shelter like he was just another case. Not after everything. Questions hammered in my head. What happened to him after that night? Where was I when he started to fall? Would things have been different if I'd looked for him? I knew I wasn't responsible for saving everyone. I'd learned that early in this job. But what about when the person who needs saving is the one who already saved you? Doesn't that change everything? A cold weight settled in my chest, a mix of guilt and helplessness, and beneath it, a quiet anger. Anger at, myself for pretending that night was just a page in my story, when in reality it was an entire chapter with consequences that had been unfolding for years. Anger at the world for chewing up people who put themselves on the line for others. And more than anything, an uncomfortable anger, realizing I might not have the courage to do what needed to be done. When I looked at him, I saw two versions of Nathan, the hero who came out of nowhere to save me, and the broken man in front of me now, soaked, clutching a shopping cart full of the remains of his life. But something in both versions was the same. That steady gaze, the one that said he'd faced worse than anyone could imagine. My finger twitched over the radio button, but I couldn't press it. I knew that if I confirmed the incident, I'd be signing off on a path that might send him even further into the pit. And if I lied to the dispatch, I'd be taking a massive risk with my career. I could lose the badge, the credibility, everything. Then he spoke again, and his words sliced through my thoughts. I don't need you to save me. I just need you not to turn me in. Those words cut deep. He wasn't asking for spare change, a bed, or pity. He was asking me to break the cycle, to not do to him what so many had already done, discard him like a problem to be removed. And in that moment, I realized the conflict inside me was no longer about whether or not to follow the rules. It was about deciding which part of me would survive this night. The officer who closes his eyes to protect himself, or the man who keeps them open even if it costs him everything. I knew that whatever I decided, there would be no going back, and the clock in my conscience was already ticking. The radio crackled again on my shoulder, this time with the dispatcher's voice firmer, pressing for a status update. I felt the pressure tighten around my neck. The fine drizzle had turned into a steady mist, dripping from the brim of my cap and hitting the ground in slow, deliberate beats, marking the rhythm of my indecision. Every second I stood there increased the chance that dispatch would send another unit, and with it, the risk of losing control of the situation. I looked at Nathan. He didn't look away. There was something in his face that wasn't just exhaustion. It was as if he'd already accepted whatever fate I chose for him, good or bad, and that made it even harder to breathe. I'd seen plenty of people on the street clinging to whatever scraps of hope they could, but there was no plea in his eyes. There was surrender, a silent surrender that screamed louder than any beg for mercy. My training roared in my head, repeating the lines of the manual: stabilize the scene, remove the individual from the area, transport to appropriate services. But my conscience roared back: if you do that, you'll erase him for good. I knew a shelter wasn't a solution for him. It would just be a temporary holding cell where the world would forget about him for a few hours until he ended up back in the same place, even more broken. The image of the alley hit me again. Me on the ground, the gun aimed at my chest. The shot that never came because he shoved me out of the way. I remembered the impact of his body against the attacker, the brief struggle, the sound of heavy breathing, and how he vanished before I could even thank him. I remembered his blood on my glove, and how that warmth stayed burned into my memory even after I'd tried to wash it away. I couldn't ignore it. I owed my life to him, and maybe this was my only chance to repay him, even if not in any way written in the manual. I pressed the radio button. My voice came out calm, steady. Unit 12 to dispatch. Area checked. Individual no longer on scene. Situation under control. I released the button. The silence that followed was deafening. I had just lied to dispatch. A clean break from the chain that bound me to procedure. I knew the weight of it. I knew that. If anyone found out, I'd have to answer for it. But in that moment, I didn't care. Nathan looked at me, surprised, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. I stepped closer, closing the space between us. "You're not here for me tonight," I said firmly, "and no one's going to find you here when they come looking." He opened his mouth as if to speak, but shut it again. Instead, he gave me the smallest nod, so subtle it was almost imperceptible. It felt like the kind of understanding only two people tied together by a debt of life could share. I scanned the street. We needed to move before another patrol came through as a precaution. "You got somewhere you can go right now?" I asked. He hesitated, then jerked his chin toward the end of the street. "Behind the old station. There's an abandoned warehouse. No one bothers me there." I nodded, pulled a folded bill from my wallet, and handed it to him. He took longer than I expected to accept it, as if the gesture was harder to swallow than any humiliation he'd faced before. When he finally did, he met my eyes. "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do," I replied, my voice heavy, "and I might never be able to pay it back." We started walking down the wet sidewalk. I kept my pace slow, unhurried, as if stretching those minutes could buy us both more time to breathe. I knew that once dispatch closed the call in the system, this night would live on paper as a routine, uneventful incident. But for me, and for Nathan, it would mark a turning point. And in that quiet, rainy stretch of street, I realized my decision hadn't just been about protecting Nathan. It had been about protecting the part of me that still believed it was worth risking everything for another person, even if it cost me the very thing I'd built my life on. As soon as Nathan disappeared around the corner, pushing his cart with almost ceremonial care, the street seemed to exhale again. The distant hum of an engine, the drip of water from awnings, even the irregular flicker of the street lamp, all of it fell back into place, as if the city had just been waiting for that scene to end so it could keep going. I stood there for a few seconds, watching the spot where he'd vanished, trying to convince myself I'd done the right thing. But deep down, I already knew. Nothing was going to be the same after tonight. I got back into the patrol car, shut the door, and gripped the steering wheel without moving. Dispatch didn't question my report, but I knew that lie was still fresh in the system, like a crack in glass that could spread at any moment. One camera angle showing Nathan still in the area, one more call from the same address, and the whole thing could shatter. I started the engine and drove slowly around the block, partly to keep up appearances, partly because my mind was still stuck on Jefferson Street. The radio stayed busy with calls to other units, the rhythm of police work carrying on as if nothing had happened. But in my head, I was replaying every detail. The way Nathan looked at me, the St. Michael pendant in its box, the frayed police patch. Each one a reminder that I had just crossed a line I'd sworn never to cross. Then I caught sight of another patrol unit in my rearview mirror turning onto the street behind me. My gut tightened. If they decided to roll through Jefferson, they could run right into Nathan before he reached that warehouse. My hand hovered over the radio, ready to make up another excuse, but they drove past without even glancing down that way. I let out a quiet breath, forcing myself not to smile at the relief. The first consequence was obvious. I was now compromised. That decision had put me in a place where there was no easy way back. If it came out, I'd have to choose between telling the truth and building a bigger lie to cover it. And as a cop, I knew how serious that was. Not just legally, but morally. I kept driving until I reached the far end of Jefferson, where I parked for a few minutes under the pretense of monitoring the area. In reality, I was just making sure Nathan had enough time to get away before another call came through. While I sat there, my personal phone buzzed, a message from my partner, who was busy at another scene. "Heard you got a homeless case on Jefferson. Everything good?" I typed back quickly. "Yeah, nothing big, just a misunderstanding." I hit send and pocketed the phone like I was hiding a loaded gun. The second consequence was quieter, but just as dangerous. I'd opened a door inside myself. Until tonight, my work had been surrounded by walls, rules, structure, chain of command. I'd stayed behind them. But by stepping over that line for Nathan, I'd knocked part of that wall down. And the dangerous part was realizing that, under the right circumstances, I might do it again. I sat there watching raindrops trace crooked paths down the windshield. I thought about Nathan, about the way he held that pendant like it was the most precious thing he owned. That man had saved my life without knowing who I was, and now he was walking alone toward a cold, damp warehouse. I wanted to believe this was temporary for him, that I'd see him again under better circumstances. But the truth was, for now, all I'd done was buy him and myself a little more time. By the time I pulled away for the next call, I realized the third consequence had already set in: the watchfulness. From here on out, every call, every patrol, every radio check would carry the same question in the back of my mind. What if it's another Nathan? What if I had to make that choice again between the law and my own conscience? The shift wasn't over yet, but I knew my life had already turned. And from now on, there was no longer a clean road for me to follow. I was already a few blocks away when I saw in my rearview mirror a shadow emerging from a side alley and heading toward me. For a second, I thought it was just paranoia, that the tension of the night was playing tricks on me. But as I slowed down, I recognized the slow gait and the squeak of the shopping cart with every step. It was Nathan. He must have taken a different route, maybe to avoid running into another patrol. I pulled the car over into the darkest part of the street and killed the engine. He approached slowly, like he was being careful not to invade my space. He stopped by the side of the patrol car and for a moment just looked at me through the window. I opened the door and stepped out. The rain was still falling lightly, the sound of it hitting the car's metal skin filling the silence between us. "I thought you'd already be at the warehouse," I said, more to break the ice than out of real curiosity. He shrugged. "There's something I needed to say before you disappeared again." There was weight in those words, a tone that pulled my focus tight. He looked at the ground, searching for courage, then lifted his eyes to mine. "That night, in the alley, I didn't just save a cop, I saved someone who reminded me of myself before I lost everything." I stayed quiet, absorbing every word. He went on. "I looked at you and saw a young guy with that spark in his eyes I used to have. I saw someone who still believed he could make a difference. And, I don't know. I couldn't let that die there in the street because of two cowards with a gun." The way he spoke wasn't sentimental. It was raw, direct, almost painful to hear. "You think I regret what happened to me afterward?" he asked with a faint, bitter smile. "No, I regret not being able to hold on to that spark I saw in you." His words hit deep, stirring something I hadn't felt in a long time. For years, I'd gotten used to working on autopilot, following orders, avoiding attachment. But hearing that was like someone had put a mirror in front of me, showing that maybe I had been losing the same thing he'd lost. "And why do you still keep this?" I asked, nodding toward the St. Michael pendant in his hand. He held it tight, like it was part of him. "Because it reminds me that even after everything, there's still something worth protecting. Reminds me that if I ever get the chance to help someone again, I will, even if it costs me what it cost before." We stood in a heavy silence. The street was empty, but it felt like every sound in the city had gone quiet just to hear this conversation. Then he took a step forward, closing the gap between us. "You think you owe me something, but you're wrong. The only debt is not letting go of what I saw in you that night, no matter how many years pass or how many rules try to harden you." Those words didn't feel like advice. They felt like an order, but one that came from deep inside, not from a superior. A reminder of who I'd been before the scars, before the coldness, before I'd learned to protect myself, even from good things. I didn't know what to say. All I managed was, "Then maybe I need you just as much as you think you need me." He smiled. A short, almost imperceptible smile, but it was real. Without another word, he started walking away again, pushing the cart in the opposite direction. I stood there watching him fade into the rain. But unlike before, there was something different in the air. A feeling that somehow that conversation had changed the course, not just of my night, but of my entire life. Because for the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't just following procedure anymore. I was trying to be worthy of the look he'd once given me when I didn't even know if I deserved it. I stayed on the sidewalk for a few minutes after Nathan disappeared into the darkness, with the strange sensation that the noise of the city had returned. But inside me, everything was still silent. It was as if the conversation had left an echo that refused to fade, a weight that didn't hurt but that I knew I would carry for a long time. In my career, I had been through situations that demanded quick decisions, sometimes hard ones, that could change a person's life in seconds. But nothing compared to what had just happened. Not because of the obvious danger, but because of how deeply it shook something inside me. What Nathan said about seeing in me something he himself had lost kept hammering in my head like a silent siren. I started remembering things I hadn't thought about in years. The first time I put on the uniform, the proud look in my mother's eyes on graduation day, the almost naive certainty that as long as I was on the streets, I could make a difference. I remembered the excitement of those first patrols, when every call felt like an opportunity to help, not just another line in a report. And I realized that somewhere between those memories and today, that spark had started to fade. Not all at once, but slowly. With each frustration, each injustice I couldn't prevent, each moment when bureaucracy won over humanity. That night made me see I'd been turning into someone who executed orders with precision, but no longer looked for the stories behind the people. I had been protecting myself too much, building walls to keep from feeling too much, because in this job, feeling too much can destroy you. But in doing so, I was destroying the very part of me that made me choose this profession in the first place. Nathan, even broken, even living on the margins, still carried a piece of purpose. Maybe he didn't have a home, a uniform, or a badge anymore, but he had a memory that kept him human, and that memory was me, frozen in the moment he saved me. The irony was that while I spent years trying to kill that memory, he spent years holding on to it so he wouldn't lose himself completely. That reversal made me think about the weight we carry without realizing it. I'd always believed my actions stayed in the moment. Arrest someone, help a victim, close a case. But looking at Nathan, I saw that sometimes a gesture you make in seconds can become someone's anchor for years. And the same way, one careless act can push someone even further into the dark. I got back in the patrol car but didn't start it right away. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. I didn't see the hardened officer who usually stared back at me at the end of a shift. I saw someone with tired eyes, but with a spark still alive, a spark I thought I had lost. Somehow, Nathan had reignited it. I'm not saying that from that night on, I decided to throw the rulebook out the window or become some kind of rogue hero, but I understood that following the rules to the letter doesn't mean abandoning empathy. That protocol matters, but it should never smother the human instinct to protect. And more than that, I realized the greatest danger in this job isn't taking a bullet or walking into a dark alley. It's becoming someone who sees people only as cases to be solved. The change wasn't a lightning bolt. It was more like a subtle course correction, quiet but undeniable. From that night on, I knew I'd start looking at every call as an entire story, not just a problem to fix. And that meant carrying the responsibility of keeping that spark alive, not just in me, but in anyone who crossed my path. Nathan had saved me twice, once in that alley, pulling me out of the line of fire, and again that night, pulling me out of an apathy I didn't even know had taken hold of me. And even though he would never ask for it, I knew that from now on, my life would be lived trying to be worthy of that kind of debt, not as a burden, but as a compass. When I finally started the engine and pulled away, it felt like I was leaving a scene that could never truly fit inside any report. Dispatch had already marked the call as closed, but I knew it wasn't over. Not for me. On paper, the incident was clean. Area checked, individual no longer on scene, no apparent threat. But what had happened went far beyond the cold, stripped-down language the system demanded. On the drive back to the station, the rain began to fade until it was just a damp mist hanging in the air. The streets seemed quieter, as if the whole city had decided to rest. My eyes stayed alert, scanning for movement, but my mind was still stuck back on Jefferson Street, in that forgotten corner of the city that had, for some reason, become the center of everything that night. When I parked in the station lot, I stayed inside the patrol car for a few minutes, forehead resting against the steering wheel. Part of me wanted to just go home, take a hot shower, and let it all slip away. Another part knew I couldn't. and in some strange way, didn't want to. Inside, I headed to the dispatch room to file the official report. The computer screen stared back at me with its blank fields. Incident type, actions taken, additional notes. Typing those words in the required clinical tone felt almost painful. I was compressing a moment of life, of change, into 3 impersonal lines. I wrote, call answered, area checked, no threats present, scene cleared. Then I hit save and felt as if I'd buried the truth all over again. As I packed up my gear to end the shift, one of my fellow officers asked casually, heard you got a homeless case on Jefferson. All good? I nodded, keeping my voice flat. Yeah, nothing serious, just a misunderstanding. That was the version the world would get, and I'd have to live with that. But inside, I knew the night had been a turning point. Before leaving, I went to my locker and took out a small box I kept there. Inside was a St. Michael pendant identical to the one Nathan had returned, though not the original, just a replica I'd bought years ago to replace what I thought I'd lost. I held it for a moment, and for the first time, it felt empty. The real one was back with me now, carrying its full history. The copy was just metal. The original was a symbol. I closed the box and slipped it into the inner pocket of my jacket, deciding to keep it close as a reminder of what that night meant. When I stepped outside, the cold air hit my face, and instinctively, I glanced toward Jefferson Street. I had no way of knowing if Nathan had made it to that abandoned warehouse or if he'd already moved on to another part of the city. Part of me wanted to drive back and check. Another part understood that he needed space, and that my presence, no matter how well-intentioned, could break the fragile truce we'd built. I drove home with a strange blend of closure and unfinished business. Closure because, for now, I'd kept Nathan out of the system. Unfinished because his life was still far from safe or stable. I knew I couldn't fix everything, but I also knew I wouldn't be able to live as if nothing had happened. When I walked into my house, I set the uniform on the chair and stood in the dim light of the living room, listening to the distant patter of the lingering rain. The night was officially over, but the story was far from finished. And in that stillness, I understood. On paper, the incident was done. But in my life, it had only just begun. Because somehow, I knew I'd cross paths with Nathan again. And when that happened, I wanted to be ready, not just as a cop, but as a man. Dawn found the city still damp, carrying that cold asphalt smell that always reminds me that no matter how long the night has been, the world moves on. The sun appeared timid behind gray clouds, casting a diffused light over the streets, as if even it was tired. I was standing on my porch holding a mug of hot coffee, the St. Michael pendant resting on the table in front of me. The cool metal caught the faint light, and I couldn't stop staring at it, not as a reflection of my face, but as a reflection of the part of me I had almost lost. I'd spent the whole night trying to figure out why what happened had hit me so deeply, and I realized it wasn't just about the debt I felt I owed Nathan. It was about what he represented, a brutal reminder that behind every call, there's a story no one sees. It's easy, wearing the badge, to look at someone and see only the surface, suspect, victim, homeless individual, and forget there's a past, a reason, a weight that person is carrying. I'd gotten used to working on autopilot, believing it was necessary to keep my emotions in check to survive. And maybe it is, to a point. But if you close yourself off too much, you risk becoming part of the problem. The lesson I took away was simple, and yet one of the hardest to live by. The badge gives me authority to act, but it's what I do as a human being that defines the kind of cop I really am. Following protocol is essential, but not at the cost of erasing empathy. I can't save everyone, and I learned that early, but I can at least try not to push anyone further down. With Nathan, that choice carried weight. He wasn't just some stranger. He was living proof that a single act, even one made in the heat of the moment without thinking, can change the course of someone's entire life. He did that for me, and now I had the chance, however small, to do something for him. Maybe it wouldn't be a grand change. Maybe it wouldn't solve all his problems. But that night, in that moment, It was enough to keep him standing. As I sipped my coffee, I thought about what he'd told me, that the only debt was to not let go of what he'd seen in me that night in the alley. And I realized this wasn't just about the two of us. It's about everyone who comes into this job with a spark in their eyes, a naive faith in change, and how over time that spark can be worn down by the weight of the work. Keeping it alive is an act of resistance, maybe even harder than facing any criminal. Police work is made up of calls that blur together, reports that pile up, and faces that pass too quickly to remember. But every once in a while, a moment breaks through the flow, a choice that doesn't fit in the manual, a memory that refuses to be filed away. And it's in those moments that you see yourself for who you really are, without the badge, without the medals, without the armor of a title. That's what Nathan gave me, a mirror that didn't distort a thing, forcing me to face what I was becoming. I finished my coffee, slipped the pendant into my pocket, and felt its weight against my chest, not as a burden, but as a silent commitment. I didn't know if I'd ever see Nathan again, or maybe I would, in ways I couldn't predict. But whether or not our paths crossed, that night had already left a permanent mark. As the Yas city began to stir, I felt something in me wake up too, and I promised, to myself and to the man who saved me twice, that I would never let that part of me fall asleep again. Because in the end, it's not about how many arrests I make or how many cases I close. It's about the choices I make when no one's watching, when there are no cameras, when only my conscience is there to witness. And that's the part no report will ever record. But for me, it will always be the most important. Subscribe to the channel now if you want to hear more emotional real-life stories from police officers. And drop a comment below. Which part of this story hit you the hardest? It could be a memory, a dilemma, a single line, anything. I read every single comment. And I promise you, it's in your voices that this mission continues. I'll see you in the next episode.